If you could please come back to your seats, we'll get started on the amendment process for our district plan. I'm going to hand over to you, Sean. You can finish pouring your tea if you like.
Oh no, I wouldn't hold up democracy. Thank you, Your Worship. So, today is the last of the briefings in which the recommendations of the IHP will be put before you. To assist you in this process as we go towards your meeting on the 14th of March, I thought I would do a brief 101 on the amendment process. This will work a little bit differently from the processes you normally use under your Local Government Act processes. So, your roles as decision makers in this process are to decide whether to accept or reject the recommendations of the Independent Hearings Panel. For any recommendation you reject, you can offer an alternative. These rejected recommendations, with their alternatives and their reasons, will be referred to the Minister for the Environment. The Minister will then decide between the IHP recommendation, the alternative put to them by the Council, or may reject both. That Minister, according to speech this morning, will be Minister Bishop. There are three pathways that result from this. You can have recommendations to accept. So these are where you adopt what the IHP have recommended and the district plan is changed. There are recommendations to amend. These are recommendations from the IHP which will alter the proposed district plan as notified, and they'll replace the provisions or the maps with what they've proposed. There are also recommendations to remove. These delete things. So a worked example is a recommendation from an IHP report may look like, and these ones are entirely synthetic. I have made them myself. They are based on a small town in New Zealand. You get a chocolate fish if you can guess which one. You won't. So, in the report, it will have a recommendation. In this case, it says we recommend maximum heights of 17.5 metres and the inclusion of the site in height control area A, the green zone. And then that recommendation has altered the provision of the plan. In this case, you can see that the height limit has been changed in area A in accordance with the recommendation, and the map has been altered as well. So, to make an amendment to the district plan, you'll need your IHP recommendation, the thing you're interested in. You'll need relief, which is what do you want to do. You'll need scope, which is from where in the process are you going to get that relief from. So, the easiest way to think of this process is that we are on our way to Mars. We have been sealed into the spaceship. You can use whatever is in the spaceship, but you can't get anything from outside. And meanwhile, life progresses on Earth. You will then need your reasons for what you have done. All of those will be packaged up, and that's what myself and my staff will then send to the Minister afterwards. So in this example, we've decided the recommendation has been altered so that height control area A has a height limit of 22 metres. So the altered recommendation is at the top, the provision is then changed in accordance with that, and then the map changes as well. The scope for this has been inherited from the Process Involvement Corporation. You can see how creative I get in the evening. And that's the submission which proposed that relief. Because remember, we can't take anything from outside the process. And then the reasons for that is Council was convinced of the points in the submission, and that then aligned with the strategic direction of the plan. So, if you are to propose an alternative recommendation, you need to consider you should consider the submissions on the provisions of the plan that the amendment would relate to. So, for example, if you're interested in a particular thing, you should, and you have looked at a submission on that thing, you should look at all the other submissions that relate to that thing. It's a fairness thing. I'll try not to use the word thing anymore. It's getting confusing. Then you also need to consider any higher order instruments which you must have regard or consistency with, particularly the Resource Management Act, any national policy statements that are relevant, any regional policy statements. I realise that that's a lot of reading on top of a lot of reading. My staff are here to help you with that. And you need to also understand if there are any other consequential amendments that are required to make the plan work in practice. So, for example, you may be interested in a rule in one part of the plan, but there may be another rule which is attached to it in another part of the plan. You'll need to alter both in order to make it work. Again, we can help you through that process. One thing that I would like to remind everybody is to remember the plan is what drives the resource consenting process and ultimately the experience of people who are trying to build things and do things in the city. We need to have a plan that both achieves the objectives you have set as a council, but ultimately sets our officers up for success in the resource consenting system, and your constituents and developers and customers and anybody else you're interacting with that certain good experience of what they can do. Thank you.
So taking questions on what Sean has just taken us through, I'll start with Councillor Pennant.
Thank you, that was incredibly helpful. Look, it is quite an unusual process. We don't usually make these kinds of plan changes. So what's kind of I've never done a change on a, so what kind of level of rigour is required when you're talking about considering all the submissions, given we didn't actually hear them, and do we have to listen to the questioning of the commissioners as well?
So first of all, we're all learning together. None of us have been through this process, so it's quite all right to feel that way. I feel that way too. The second part of your question is to the degree of rigour. You can rely solely upon the IHP recommendations and their reports. However, if you are looking to change something, you're going to need to have scope for that change, which is where you will start to look at the submissions and potentially the 42A reports. Depending on what you're looking to change depends on how much you're going to have to look at, but I would think it's enough for you to read them. I don't think you need to prove to us that you've done some sort of examination on them.
Might like to. Oh no, sorry, that question's gone out of my mind. Can I just go back on the list again? Thanks.
Councillor Matthews.
So, given this higher level of, that things need to be kind of working in with the rest of the plan and we need the evidence and all of that, will there be, for example, cut-off points where we sort of don't have the time to actually do an amendment? And so I'm assuming something like an amendment from the floor, as we normally would accept in a meeting, would be sort of wouldn't work in this process.
It would be extraordinarily difficult. I still need to sit down with the chair of that committee and understand how councillors wish to run that meeting. But the difficulty is if you were to amend something on the fly in the meeting, would be then the provision of those reasons, and you would be divorcing extraordinary powers to officers in order to supply those reasons after the meeting. Frankly, I would be very uncomfortable doing it.
Can I suggest we have some sort of process where the chair actually determines what those cut-off points are with you in order to ensure a smooth running process? I know it goes against our normal standing orders. However, this is quite a different, the quasi-judicial kind of process we're in.
I'll speak with the chair about that. I would say that there is an escape mechanism for something should... I knew my metaphors would eventually get me into trouble. There is an escape mechanism in that if there was a particular problem that had arisen on the day, a councillor could move an amendment for a plan change, which would then refer the matter into another process. It would just be a matter of whether the minister would accept that or not.
Cool. Councillor Chung. You're on the list.
Okay, I'm still trying to understand exactly what the limitations are of what we can actually suggest, because keeping in mind that this follows on from Councillor Pennett's comments, is that because we weren't at the meetings, we don't. The hearings, we didn't know, what the submitter said. So, if, for example, in your plan on Ekatahuna there, if I wanted to, no, okay, if I wanted to say build subterranean houses because dig down and build a house underneath the ground, and I put that forward. Do the staff then come up and say that, oh, no, there were no submissions on underground houses, so therefore you can't submit that? Or do they come back and say that there were submissions that were similar, that had, something different, and so therefore I could use that? Or how does that actually work?
So if you read the Commissioner recommendation reports, you'll see what they have deliberated on, and you would normally see reference to a subject in there. And so, for example, should you wish to become Lord of the Mole People and tunnel beneath Ekatahuna, there's a sentence I didn't think I'd need, then you would see reference where they perhaps had considered that but then said it was outside our jurisdiction. But that would be your trail back towards that submission, which you could then appraise yourself of.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, thank you for outlining this process. First of all, could I get the sense that the Commissioner's report is on the proposed district plan?
Yep.
And so both those documents are in scope for, if you want to accept or amend or delete. So can we get a list of the specific Commissioner's reports that are, because there's also lots of evidence and submitters' reports and memorandum, and there's a lot of stuff around there in that space. So can we get a list of the specific Commissioner's reports that we would be looking to reading as the core? Not that we have to read them all, but if we wanted to change something, we would know that this is the core report around, for example, CBD Heights.
So the reports are all numbered and lettered on the council website under each stream. We could...
So all the reports were like 5A and 4B. They're got all of them.
Yes. The appendixes underneath are generally then the provisions of the plan that are being altered, but those first reports that have the, say, 1A, 1B, 1C, those are the ones that you contain the recommendations that you need to look at.
Okay. So if, I'm just picking up a rule that was done on the legal thing, if you're going to amend a report, you want to cite a submission, one of the rules that was if you're going to read one submission, you have to read them all.
On that subject.
On that subject.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, if you're going to amend a particular rule, you need to read all of the submitters on that rule.
To be fair, you should consider them, yes, if you've gone down to that level of detail. If, however, what is contained in the Commissioner's deliberations has everything you need and you don't feel you need to examine submissions, you can make a decision from that.
Okay. And in terms of timing, just in terms of practical sense of timing, if we're going to get officer support for something, do you have any indication of how late would be too late for a proposed amendment to be put to you and for you to be able to turn it around before the meeting on the 14th of March?
Naturally, it depends on the size and nature of the amendment. If it's a relatively straightforward amendment, so for example, you wish to reject the listing of a heritage tree, that would probably be 3-4 days. If, however, you wish to overhaul the entire strategic direction of the plan, last Thursday would, you would probably want about a week before the meeting.
Okay. If only to get you to turn around saying I haven't got time.
I will try not to. I'll try not to say that I don't have time.
So I'll go back on the list if that's right.
Deputy Mayor.
Quite a small question. Just around the corrections, tidy-ups, rats and mice. I can't remember how you framed them.
Yep.
do we need to go through the same process for that?
So, normally after a major planning process like this, you'll do an omnibus plan change to correct any problems that can't be dealt with under delegation. So what we would normally do is put a recommendation in that be done, and you would amend that recommendation to contain a particular concern.
Councillor Brown.
I just want to be clear I understand the sort of process using your example. So let's say I look at the proposition, the three heights, and I go, I don't really agree with that. So my next job is to try and find some evidence or some counter proposition that actually suits what I want, that's as I understand it. So I need to actually go through the submissions to find something which actually allows me to say, no, I want the higher. Or do I come to you and say, can you track that down?
So what you need to do is form a clear intention about what you would like to do. Then we can discuss matters of scope and what relief is available to you.
Okay, so let's assume that you have helped me find a submission from somebody else that actually meets, what I would like to achieve. So I then go, okay, so I want to recommend a variation to the independent panel's advice on that particular bit. Do I have to actually set out all of my sort of analysis or rationale for wanting to overturn their recommendation? And is that what goes off to Bishop? I mean, could he be as random as he likes, or does he actually have to sort of look at the an evidence-based decision, and does he have to actually provide any sort of explanation as to why he rejected the IHP's advice as well and accepted mine? And I presume he has no discretion. He's either got to be he's just got to be yes or no, right?
Karen. Sorry, I'll just call for some legal advice.
But you see, I get my basic point though, is how much explanation and analysis as opposed to just popping up with an idea and saying, I wanted to do it this way. And by the way, somebody on page 75 happened to say the same thing.
Sorry, and I'll just clarify, I didn't call for legal advice. I called for advice from someone who works in our legal area. Just before I get corrected.
Kia ora, councillors. New elements to your question there, so just check through those again.
Okay, so I've looked at, using Sean's example, I've looked at the recommendation, the three heights. I decided I don't like that. I want higher. And then so my first thing is, I understand I have to find some evidence, or at least I have to find a proposition in somebody's submission that actually suits what my aspirations. So the first question is, I've got to, find that counter proposal to what the panel. The second question really is, do I have to, when I actually come up with my decision to reject the panel's advice and go with the higher heights, do I have to actually set out a full explanation of that, or can I just say I've decided that I reject them and I like these guys better and therefore it's going to 22 metres? And then the third part is, once it goes off to Bishop and he's got these two options, the panel's versus mine, theirs fully argued and explained and whatnot, and mine much more abbreviated, maybe not even argued at all. Does he have to provide any justification of his decision, or can he just put this dart in the dartboard and say I prefer this one over the other one? And I guess in the Bishop point, is he allowed is there a third way for him, or does he have to go with the panel's advice or the council law's advice?
So, do you need to provide reasons? Is yes, just as a general principle of administrative law, that you do need to provide reasons for your decisions. And I guess from a legal point of view as well, that having those provided contemporaneously is also helpful for us, because we can actually use that to show, well, this was the lawful basis for the decision that you've made. And that would apply similarly to the minister. So we would expect them to provide reasons for their decisions as well. So there's a slightly different framework around how the minister and what they consider versus what you can do. So the minister is also restricted in what they can look at. So they can only take into account only those considerations that, again, the IHP could have taken into account. There's a few other sort of things around procedural requirements that they can also consider. What they're doing is they are, again, choosing to accept or reject any or all of the recommendations that have been referred to them. And if they choose to reject it, they can then decide whether to accept the alternative recommendation that was referred to them.
So basically it's A or B for him. And does it matter that he's clearly expressed some strong opinions about certain aspects of the IHP's thinking? Has that got any connotation in a legal sense? Do you have any concerns about that?
I would probably leave that for him to get his legal advice around what he should and shouldn't be saying, and how that may be impacting his decisions.
Is there anything else that we ask for a bishop to actually give his opinion on? No, this doesn't.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Free, and then we kind of go back onto the other list.
Just a process question. If we were to make even one change or recommendation to the minister, does that mean he's free to kind of inspect the whole thing?
No, he inherits his scope of decision making from you.
Okay.
So if you accept the panel's recommendation, then that is effectively removed from the system and becomes operative.
Yeah, no, I gather that. But if we do make some changes, does he restrict his jurisdiction just over the areas that we've decided to make amendments? He doesn't have jurisdiction on the bits we leave alone.
That's correct.
Right.
Cool. So we've still got questions from Councillor Pennant and Councillor Randall, and then I think I might draw a line so we can move on to the briefing. Councillor Pennant.
Sorry, I just want to get absolute clarity. Some of the councillors have asked. So, and I've done commissioner training. The reasons I would give for making an amendment, to what level of rigour does it need to be done? So, would it be helpful if I said, Rule 12.3.6 needs to be amended to this word as opposed to that word? And also, just following on from Councillor Brown's question, does the minister actually have to provide evidence from the hearing as to why he would make such a conclusion? Because he seems to have some strong views.
So, the first question you had was around the level of rigour required for your reasons. You
want 12 pages from me, Sean?
I'm probably going to get it. The panel, the independent hearings panel, have heard submitters and spent a great deal of time and effort coming to their conclusions. They're not to be lightly put aside, so you need to show your reasoning to do so. It's not a small thing. In those reasons, we want to understand why you're looking to amend the plan and to what effect, essentially.
Then, sorry, just a quick follow-up question. If we like something the Commissioner's done, but another colleague doesn't like it, and then we want to provide a compromise, do we then have to provide the reasons why the compromise would be needed? That I believe in compromise.
I was going to say. So the chain of events would be an amendment is put for, shall we say, all the city to be painted purple. You eventually compromise and say that actually pastels will be okay. Stripes then, Councillor. Very good. That first amendment would have been lost and then would have been replaced by the second amendment, and the second amendment will stand alone.
But then you have to provide reasons for your compromise position when you move an amendment?
Yes, but that compromise amendment will have had to be a standalone amendment.
Oh yeah, no. Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Randall.
Thank you. So, in terms of officer support will also be available to councillors if they wish to oppose an amendment or a deletion?
Officers' support will be provided to any position a councillor wishes to take. However, it remains your amendment.
Yes, I mean, I'm talking, yeah, okay. In terms of, so I'm just reflecting on Councillor Brown's view of the process. I just want to check, we're really sitting as in a judicial role, so we're really weighing up the evidence presented to us. So really, in theory, at least, it's not so much that if we want higher building heights that we go hunting for a submitter that looks at it. You know, in theory, what we are doing is we're looking at the Commission's report, we are looking to challenge a particular conclusion of the Commissioner's recommendations, so then we read the submitter's evidence, and then we find a submitter whose evidence is more compelling, arguably, and that's what we're putting an amendment towards supporting.
Yes, another way of thinking of it is you're assessing the balance of decision making.
Yeah. Okay, and in terms of, that means that if someone wants to amend or delete any provision, they really need to cite and support for reasoning. They're really throwing their weight and saying this submitter or this set of submitters has a greater weight, and then flesh out that reasoning to as evidence to support an alternative rule.
Yes, and that's why I began explaining by your assessing the recommendation of the AHP rather than simply altering the plan provision as you did when the plan was notified.
Okay, thank you.
And just from a process perspective, so we'll have you sit down with the chair this week or whenever possible and just kind of reiterate the process for amendments and alternative recommendations and so forth. Cool. So the next part of the briefing, number 5, I'll hand back over to whoever's presenting that.
Sure. Do you want to just take it right from the top? Kia ora, Mayor and Councillors. Jamie Searle here, Senior Planning Advisor in the District Planning team. So we've got two of us that are presenting today, and I'm taking you through the natural and coastal hazards. So we've got, today we've got the natural hazards, so that includes the natural hazards and the coastal hazards, which can get confusing, but we'll work through that. The 3 waters chapter, earthworks chapter, subdivision chapter, and noise chapter. So that just really summarises the higher order direction, which essentially sets the requirements for council in terms of our hazard risk management in the plan. So it's not really an opt-in kind of scenario. There's a lot of requirement there, and I think the main point there is kind of that avoidance of increasing risk and high hazard. So the district plan, the proposed district plan, implements a risk-based approach to natural hazards. So that aligns with your non-statutory guidance. It also reflects some of the more recently reviewed district plans in the region. And it essentially reflects the likelihood, consequence, and sensitivity of different activities. So for example, something like an emergency service facility, highly hazard sensitive, we are more restrictive and controlling around that compared to something like a commercial activity or a park bench where you don't need as much control to manage that hazard risk. So in terms of the natural hazards managed by the plan, you've got flooding, and that's informed by the Wellington Water modelling, fault rupture, which is informed by the GNS science data, liquefaction, again GNS science, and then the coastal hazards. So the coastal inundation, which is storm surge and sea level rise, is based on NIWA data, and the tsunami inundation hazard is GNS science data as well, and that includes sea level rise. So land stability is also managed by the plan, but managed through earthworks provisions, which don't sit in the natural hazards chapter. So in terms of just that split, in terms of the process, the majority of the provisions sit within the ISPP process, but there are some provisions which have gone through the standard planning process, and those specifically around the coastal environment chapter, and are focused on some of the introduction to the chapter, and also some of the infrastructure, airport, port, and central city kind of specific plan provisions. So in brief, there were 62 submitters, 16 submitters spoke at the hearing. The focus really was predominantly planning and legal. There was, I think, one coastal expert, but really the science around the topics wasn't really in contention at all. It was more around the constraints on develop and how the plan provisions actually work and how they're implemented. So I think, so the next few following slides, I guess, touch on some of the key changes that are recommended by the hearings panel. But I think a couple of the key takeaways here, just to lead into that, are that the natural hazard provisions, or the changes to the natural hazard provisions, don't result in a material change to enabled housing supply. And really, I guess they could be summarised as essentially refining the implementation of the proposed rules and the outcomes of the plan. So just turning to some of the more specific recommended changes. So I guess there's some amendments to the overall kind of objective and policy direction around the discouragement of development in high hazard, and then enabling development in your medium and low hazard, subject to the incorporation of kind of hazard resilience and mitigation measures. One of the other, one of the other changes is around policy support for activities in hazard risk areas that have an operational functional need to be in there. So like your central city area, the port, the airport. So that's again just a refinement really. And it ensures that those types of activities have policy kind of support and a consenting pathway through that process. So fault hazard. The main change, I guess, is through introducing a greater level of detail in terms of the complexity of those faults. So it does get very complex, and this was something that was discussed in length through the hearings process. But essentially the result is that the plan has different rules for the different faults, and they're more constraining where both the recurrence interval, so the likelihood of fault rupture through an earthquake is relevant to the fault, such as Wellington, and so there's more constraints on development within that fault, whereas Te Rewhiti or Shepherd's Gully, lower recurrence period, and then less kind of knowledge around exactly the extent. So the provisions is more enabling to reflect that. So that's illustrating the change from the PDP proposed district plan to the recommended change. So the extents of all of those faults has not changed at all. So no additional properties are impacted in terms of the extent, but there's a greater nuance in terms of the rules that apply depending on the category that they fall within. So I guess overall, it's a better reflection of a risk-based approach. Tsunami and coastal inundation. So one of the more significant changes there is reduction of very low depths of inundation, so less than 5 centimetres, and that was supported by the experts that were supporting council or the Section 42A informing and recommending to the panel. So that then results in coastal inundation, tsunami inundation, and the inland flooding as well, all being consistent in terms of not controlling where it's lower than 5 centimetres. So the result is that fewer properties are impacted by that because of the very low risk that's associated with that very low level of inundation. In the central city, one of the bigger changes in terms of the coastal provisions is around slightly more enabling provisions around building additions where they are low risk and they're above ground floor. So we've got a range of maps here, hard to tell at this, kind of to see the difference. So it really is the reduction of that low 0 to 5 centimetres is almost difficult to pick up, but these also are helpful, I guess, in just illustrating the extent of these hazard overlays. So it's probably, I'll touch on them just slightly, but I don't have any other comment other than they all illustrate a slight reduction in the various overlays. So it's really just around the edges, but it does result in a number of properties no longer being impacted. We can come back to these, I guess, if there are any questions on them. Use them to aid any responses. So hazard mitigation structures, another one that just was refined slightly in response to submissions from the airport. There are a number of parts of the plan that kind of deal with hazard mitigation structures, but in terms of the coastal hazards, there were just some small tweaks, I guess, just to make sure that there's a consenting pathway and that the maintenance and repair is enabled. And finally, flood hazard, so non-coastal. There was refinement to the policies and rules, particularly around the building floor levels that would be required. And I guess that nuance between the low, medium, high risk, which the stream corridors, overland flow paths and inundation areas reflect. Liquefaction hazard, there was I guess an error in the PDP which attributed a high hazard rating to liquefaction, but that has been reduced to low hazard. The Building Act and the code essentially manage liquefaction risk, but the plan simply manages emergency service facilities to make sure that they're operational post-event. So that's a quick summary. Happy to take any questions.
Hi, so you said that the changes that were made didn't impact any of the building, the quantity of building, but in Kilburnie actually a whole lot more was consented. And I have asked for the scientific evidence that changed between the original plan that we took out to the community, which had hardly any impact on the existing build, and then apparently the scientific evidence changed, and then a walking catchment was put. A lot more building was potentially consented, almost all the isthmus actually. And I don't understand the change of the evidence, and I have asked staff for that data. I haven't received it. I need to understand it as a water councillor. I need to understand what happened in the process.
Sure. I mean, I can only speak to, I only came to council post notification of the plan, so I probably can't help answer that question currently, but we can come back to you with the information that you said.
I need to understand it fairly urgently. I've asked about 10 days ago now.
Yeah, Councillor Free has an outstanding request, and Sean, I was hoping we could cover that in this briefing because it's relating to hazards.
Yes, and so that reduction of the low hazard area is the key thing that has changed. That's allowed more less hazard prone area towards the centre of the isthmus, which has then been reflected in the land zoning.
What hazard?
So you would have seen that the below 5 centimetre inundation tsunami hazards have changed. Those are the ones that are the key changes.
I didn't notice a huge change, but okay. I do need to really understand this.
Yeah.
I don't at the moment.
Councillor Chung.
Thank you. I have three questions. The first is that you commented back there that you're saying that you would discourage development, or council should discourage development in high hazard areas. Shouldn't that be a bit more than discouraged? Because if they do build there, what is the liability of council if something happens, if they get flooded? Would the council be liable because we allowed them to build there?
So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's probably more of a strongly discouraged. The language is in the policies is avoid. It's not increasing risk, so it's for the most part like a hazard-sensitive activity, like residential type activity would be a non-complying activity. So
okay.
Strongly discouraged.
Okay, great, thanks. Second one is that looking at some of these diagrams is a bit like the two cartoons that you get, spot the difference between the two. They both look very similar to me, but when you're looking at the fault hazard, you showed the fault lines, and then on the other one, you showed what the IHP recommendation was, and again, it looked the same, but my understanding of what happened in Christchurch is that they looked at where the fault lines were, but in fact, a lot of the damage to the buildings down there weren't actually on the fault line, but were actually peripheral to it. And so how far out do you actually need to look to say this is close to the fault line? And because we've got so many through Wellington, how broad is that area of coverage?
So it depends on the particular seismic hazard you're dealing with. So the main reason the fault lines are picked out on those maps is because of the shear risk, which is the risk from splitting in half. That risk only occurs on the known fault lines. And so what you'll also see is the widths of the fault lines are slightly different, and that's got to do with the confidence interval, also how precisely pinpointed that shear zone is. They're also coloured because different sets of rules apply to them depending on those factors.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, and my last question is that if we adopt the IHP recommendations, those properties that are actually inside those fault line areas, will they be notified to say that, look, you may have lived here for 100 years, but we've now designated that area as a possible fault there? So would we engage with them to understand what they do? And again, what's the council's position in that? Would we be liable to acquire those places if they said, oh, you've scared the heck out of me and I think I'll go now?
The Wellington fault has been well known for some time now, and there are shear zones in the operative district plan. So from that point of view, no, we're not obligated to purchase those properties. There will probably need to be the information on the district plan will then go into the inputs to the LIM reports, and that's how property owners are generally notified of these things when they look to get a LIM report.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you. Sorry, I haven't had time to read all of this. How did the commissioners treat the national seismic hazard model? Did they agree with the way that you had interpreted it in terms of the increased shaking in some parts of the city?
I'm not sure of the answer to that, Councillor.
I could ask the commissioners when they come. Okay, that's all good. And I guess just one of my frustrations with the planning process is it's so slow, so that we can't incorporate the latest scientific information as we get it, right? So in terms of sea level rise and all the risks that we have, do you think that it's about right from what we know now, but we'll be able to go back within a couple of years and change some of the rules around where people can build? And the insurers may force us to anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, my first comment would be that it's based on best available information. With respect to coastal and sea level rise, our NIWA expert looked at that more recent guidance and said that we're still within that kind of comfort area in terms of the more recent MFE guidance. So that's detailed in his evidence if you'd like to look at the detail of that.
In the future, with greater climate adaptation planning and what we learn from that, particularly as decisions about what forms of infrastructure to be invested in and where, that will naturally flow through to changes in the regulatory system.
Okay, and thank you. And just the last question. Look, I get there is a distinction between the Building Act and the RMA, but why can we just discount liquefaction until the Building Act when the planning rules set where you can build in the first place? So I just don't quite get why we can't look at that in more detail.
It's not a matter of can't look at it. What we have done is used liquefaction risk to manage the most high-risk activities. But in doing so, that's basically where do you put hospitals, ambulance stations, things like that. But what we are very conscious of is not creating duplicate processes that are managing the same thing between the two acts. Because then you can very easily over time get misalignment between the two acts, and you end up with two slightly different processes which create a crack that people then fall between.
But couldn't someone then decide to develop in one place and get consent for that and then run a cropper in the Building Act stage? As it would stand, the Constraining Act would become the Building Act unless you were building an ambulance station.
Cool. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Just regarding the natural hazards, sea level rise and storm surge on the south coast, were there any changes made to the maps there at all, particularly Awhirō Bay?
It'd just be that slight reduction to remove that less than 5 centimetres. So that's
right.
That less than 5 centimetres has been taken off the high scenario and the medium scenario. So there'll be a slight. Yeah, you'd have to zoom in to see it.
Yeah.
But
you do have an interactive map that's available to yourselves and the public on the proposed district plan decisions recommendations page. I suggest having a look at that.
Thank you.
Councillor Free.
Actually, I've decided I just need to take this one offline, but thank you for everybody's patience.
Thank you, Councillor. That's the end of that list. Is this the end of the presentation? No. Next part.
No, Mr. Wharton will take us through the next part.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou. Good afternoon, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, councillors. So I will be moving on into the remaining topics for this presentation, which Three Waters Earthworks subdivision and noise. I also have my colleagues here who are topic leads for some of these, so I may need to bring them in to answer specific questions as we go. Just so you're probably already familiar, but Three Waters covers our drinking water, stormwater, and our wastewater. And all of the Three Waters provisions fell under the Intensification planning instrument. So it was interesting hearing your previous presentation on the water bylaw and the Wellington water regional standards, because these are quite relevant here. And so this is showing the other side about how the new development is affecting our existing Three Waters infrastructure. As well as that, these provisions in the district plan help manage the flood risks and also help us and Wellington Water meet our stormwater discharge conditions. And also noting that we do have national direction on freshwater management that says that our council does have to include provisions in our district plan to promote positive effects and avoid, remedy, and mitigate adverse effects. It's worth noting that in the proposed district plan that was notified, there is a fair bit more than what we had in the previous plan. So we are introducing some new objectives, policies and rules, and as was mentioned previously, the Wellington Water Regional Standard. So this is, in moving it into the district plan, the benefit is that people can see fairly early that actually, yeah, we have to meet this standard if we're going to develop, rather than perhaps seeing that everything's fine in the district plan and doing a fair bit of going a fair way forward in their development before realising that they can't actually connect or may need to do some other additional works. There's also provisions relating to hydraulic neutrality, water-sensitive urban design, and control of copper and zinc building materials. So we had a good number of submissions on this, 45 submitters, and the key issues they were looking at were first one being hydraulic neutrality and the level of modelling required, and that included whether we looked at the current impervious surfaces, like what's happening at the current time, or whether the hydraulic neutrality should be based on an undeveloped or like a grass state. Also, how or whether development should be limited based on infrastructure capacity and on water-sensitive urban design generally. So the panel is recommending that when it comes to the hydraulic neutrality for stormwater, that that be changed from using an undeveloped state to what was called a pre-developed state. So I'll give you an example of that. Imagine you have a developer who's taking a few houses and wanting to put in a terrace housing development of maybe 10 houses. Rather than assessing what's the amount of runoff that this development will do as it compared to if the site was just grass. And now it's being measured as what's the difference between what's the runoff now versus what the runoff would be with this new development. Another change that they're recommending is that the city centre zone is being excluded from this hydraulic neutrality rule. In terms of permeable surfaces, which were previously in the residential chapters, they're being moved into three waters chapters because, as I guess, just it makes a bit more sense to be managed consistently in that way. So the standards you see there are from what was moved through from the residential chapters in terms of 30% permeable surfaces for 1 to 3 residential units. It's actually 60% permeable surfaces for your large lot. The third point there about the maximum feasible permeable surfaces encouraged is a new change of bringing in new matters of discretion to look at water-sensitive design methods, where if someone's doing a resource consent and the planner's saying, look, got this list of things they can look at, which you'll be familiar with, all sorts of things to do with access and height or whatever, now they can also look at, for these multi-unit residential developments, they can also look at a range of water-sensitive urban design methods. And just to give you an indication of what that might look like from a more visual learning point of view, say someone is looking at a high-density development, they can, the council, in assessing that application, can look at things such as absorptive pavers, biofiltration systems, any sort of rainwater tank, those sort of development done well matters in the resource consent. So I'll pause here just so we can get to questions on the three waters before we move on to earthworks and subdivision.
Yes, Councillor Free.
I know some places like Kapiti have had, requirements for water tanks for a long time. Are we making it complicated by demanding hydraulic neutrality? Would it be simpler for people and less expensive if we were to just put, a typical requirements? Because I think that costs, the actual science costs can be quite high when you're looking at trying to do a development.
So let me introduce Maggie Cook. She's the author here.
Kia ora, Councillor Free. Sorry, can you just please repeat that question just so I can understand?
So my question was, are we making it unduly complicated and expensive for people by actually asking for modelling to ensure hydraulic neutrality? Would it be a reasonable alternative just to provide a table or something that makes it simpler of typical sizes of whatever you might be talking about, water storage tanks, holding, stormwater holding, whatever? I think it's wastewater holding, actually.
So for the 1 to 3 residential developments, the ones that fall under the NDRS standards, we do just have water solutions based on Wellington Water's recommendations. It is when you get to the more complex types of development where hydraulic neutrality modelling comes into effect, and we have had economic evidence provided around those costing, which can be found.
That's really useful to know, thank you.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you. As you know, one of my favourite subjects. Can you tell, and I'll ask the commissioners, why is the central city not included in the hydraulic neutrality rules?
I would recommend asking that to the commissioners.
Okay, and then also, you may recall, Sean, that I put a amendment through to not just talk about hydraulic neutrality. We wanted to go further than that. That was a little bit basic for me. So I'm just curious why that language is still there. I can find the reference.
It's, I can just say that that was one of the matters that the panel considered, is about how to define hydraulic neutrality and whether another term should be used, whether again it's based on going back to a pre-developed state. And so these are matters that the panel members here may want to elaborate on why they chose those particular provisions and terms over the others.
Okay, because I specifically got agreement to go further than just neutrality. So, okay, so I will ask that later. And in your view, do you think that these provisions will protect the city from excessive stormwater, given that it is coming?
In terms of the amount of stormwater, the intent of the provisions with the hydraulic neutrality is that things don't get significantly worse in terms of what the panel are recommending. In terms of protection, I think you'd have to then go back to the evidence that was presented at the hearing about what the experts expected would be the effect of those provisions.
Yeah, so does that mean, sorry, in practice we will see less green infrastructure, particularly in the central city, which was really the intent of what I was trying to achieve?
That does appear to be a bit of a hypothetical answer for us to put, so I think it's probably better to again defer to the panel on their reasoning as to why the city centre was excluded.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, and I guess in terms of the hydraulic neutrality, was there any submitted evidence that talked about the cost of changing the rule from where it is today to a rule of hydraulic neutrality and the cost of developments?
Evidence was provided to the panel from both myself and from submitters, yes.
And what did the evidence say about, did it lower or increase the costs of developments?
I believe that should be provided by the submitters. I cannot remember off the top of my head whether they provided specific numbers or an economic analysis, but there was evidence provided.
Okay, yeah.
Why don't we take that as a written question and then provide the reference back to you?
Thank you. That's a good. Thank you, Sean. And one last question: in areas where stormwater is easily able to be handled, like close to the coast and that sort of stuff, is it possible to get exemptions from the hydraulic neutrality rule?
I guess more generally, I can refer back to how Sean's talked about how resource consents tend to work. So these rules do set out the parameters, but if an applicant can show that the effects of the activity basically achieve the overall objective in perhaps a different way, then that would be a path through resource consent.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Just a quick one. I have to confess I haven't read this report in detail compared to the others. Removing the hydraulic neutrality requirements from the central city zone, did we provide evidence that the stormwater system is capable of handling growth requirements if that hydraulic neutrality condition is removed from the CCZ?
That was not provided by council. That was a submitter's recommendation.
Deputy Mayor.
So just back to clarify, the recommendations around, the stormwater, the hydraulic neutrality, will this be more favourable or less favourable to flooding impacts?
So to clarify with the hydraulic neutrality, the main change is this is around the modelling. So it's gone from undeveloped to pre-developed, and so basically the change is to what is there now versus the proposal for a grass state for modelling.
And this
is as proposed, recommended to be excluded.
Thanks.
So, essentially, we've just got to be careful not to introduce new evidence. But effectively, this would mean that areas that are paved now could remain paved. So if a paved area was experiencing flooding, this exemption would not be a tool to ameliorate that flooding.
And that brings us to the end of those questions.
Thank you, Mayor.
Very good. Earthworks next.
Yes.
Don't worry, not much more.
No. So the earthworks provisions, the intensified planning process provisions are the objective, and the ones that are affected by the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the medium density residential standards and their qualifying matters. And the other parts are being done through the standard planning process. So the high-level issues that the chapter looks at is the need to align these provisions with the national planning standards and also the regional plan, because the regional plan has earthworks provisions as well. Clarifying how to apply those permitted activity standards in the plan, and also certification requirements. So the panel is recommending these changes here, which is to do a bit of amalgamation of rules to build and maintain tracks and for natural hazard mitigation works. They are recommending adding a few new rules to fill some gaps in the significant natural areas and to ensure that biodiversity is addressed in earthworks, and also in the coastal environment, so adding a new rule, non-complying rule for earthworks in that area. And also another non-complying rule for earthworks in the ridgetop area of the upper steppings and Glenside West development areas. So that's making sure that if earthworks are happening in these delicate areas, that they actually have a rule where you have to ensure that those effects are managed. There's also minor amendments to rules and standards for earthworks in the National Grid Yard, gas transmission pipeline and airport zone, and increased transport volume of cut and fill material for the future urban zone. For subdivision, quite similar to earthworks in that the objectives and the provisions that implement the NPSUD and medium density residential standards are in the ISPP bucket, and the rest being in the standard planning process bucket. Also in the intensified bucket are subdivision rules relating to natural hazards and a few historical and cultural provisions. Some of the high-level issues, including reducing duplication, conflict, and volume of source material, which, as you can imagine, for subdivision can be quite detailed. So being clearer about what's being prescribed. Also making sure you're aligning with the national planning standards, and Also, there's new standards and directions coming through from the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and also the medium density residential standards. For example, you have to have as a controlled activity subdivision around MDRS type developments. So the panel findings in this area were the recommendations are to delete references to consent notices and legal instruments within the plan, and that's basically because they're in legislation already. We didn't want to add an additional requirement that's already in legislation. To clarify provisions, again similar to the earthworks, to put in a new restricted discretionary rule for subdivision in ridgeline and hilltops, and also the ridgetop area of Upper Steppings and Glenside West, and a new non-complying activity for subdivision within the significant natural area located inside the coastal environment. So again, these are rules to ensure that these values related to your significant natural areas, your ridgelines and hilltops, and inside the SNAs inside the coastal environment are actually protected. And also adding that areas for access to building platform be identified for each undeveloped allotment within the SNA. Outstanding natural features and landscapes is what that stands for, and the high coastal natural character area. So the panel's recommending in a way to fill some of the gaps that they saw were being carried through in the proposed plan. Now, this just looks like a whole lot of colours, I know, but the general gist is that there is an administrative amendment recommended where the rules are structured based on the natural hazard rather than the sensitivity of the activity. So, in other words, if you're trying to find the rule, you're more than likely to look at the maps and find out what is the hazard that's going to be affecting your activity and then go to those rules rather than trying to work out the sensitivity of your activity first. We think it's just an easy, or the panel recommending it as an easier way to work. The key findings from the panel for subdivision also include adding to the subdivision heritage policies. So this is to have regard to advice from a suitably qualified heritage professional in Heritage New Zealand. So that would apply to heritage areas and heritage items. There's already similar provisions for archaeological sites and sites of significance to Māori. This is a minor thing, but a deletion of subdivision in the National Grid substation buffer, which we don't actually have that buffer anymore, we just have a yard, and other minor amendments to the National Grid rule, and a deletion of controlled activity rule for subdivision and the gas transmission pipeline. So that's been replaced with a restricted discretionary, which allows that to be declined if needed. So these are quite minor changes. There's a new policy for subdivision within the inner ear noise overlay, and this is useful to align it with the notified discretionary activity rule, and also for Wellington International Airport to be notified to submit on any applications. So if there is a subdivision within that air noise overlay, then Wellington Airport is able to be aware of it and then make comment on it through the resource consent. The panel's also recommending to delete the minimum lot size for centres and industrial zones. So quite small lots are able to be applied for to provide flexibility and innovation and choice. And one last summary from me was in relation to the subdivision design guide. The panel's recommending that it be deleted because in their view they consider it added little value to the direction of the subdivision chapter overall. Some of the key points are added into the subdivision policy themselves, and other relevant parts were also covered in the residential design guide. So they said, well, they are recommending we didn't actually need the extra subdivision design guide. Okay, and moving on to the last topic, which is noise. This will be relatively quick. So the intensified bucket is for policy on development in noise-sensitive areas, for noise-sensitive new, altered and added buildings in noisy areas, and for acoustic insulation. So I've combined these, the issues and the responses here. So on the issue of how to manage the noise-sensitive activities, such as houses near the airport and other noisy areas, the panel is recommending an approach which is similar in some ways to what we have in the operative plan in terms of having high noise areas and moderate noise areas, but specifying that includes 40 metres from state highway and rail, including the Courtney Place area, industrial areas, airport, and a noise overlay. And then moderate noise areas are including 40 to 100 metres from rail and any state highway areas which are faster than 70 kilometres per hour, commercial areas, which does include the city centre zone and centres, and the port and airport outer overlays. For acoustic insulation and ventilation in noisy areas, this was actually a point of contention between experts, so the panel asked for them to get together and caucus, and they came back with quite a few areas in agreement, but a few areas still of disagreement. So the panel has gone with their preferred experts to set methods and standards for minimum outdoor to indoor noise reduction with acoustic insulation and ventilation. Those are quite detailed and technical standards, so I'm happy to perhaps send content to you in writing if you need more detail on that. In relation to vibration near the railway and state highways, so there were requests for some standards around those areas, and the panel is recommending that due to the lack of information about what's actually needed for any setback, to instead just apply a rail advisory overlay 60 metres from rail designations. And similarly, around the heliports at the hospital, the regional hospital, to have a circle there so that it's a bit of an advisory overlay. So if someone's looking at a property within that circle, they're aware that there is helicopter noise. And so just hand back to Sean before we go to questions.
Thank you. So these are the last of the independent hearings panel recommendations to be set before you. You have 2 further question and answer sessions. If you have further questions from the commissioners after today, then that will be done in writing. And otherwise, we will be here to work with you on the areas of the plan you're most interested in. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a bit of a list. I will start off though with Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you. I just wanted to understand the implications of the inner ear noise restrictions for subdevelopments. What has been the change between the previous operative district plan to the one currently now? And I just wanted to understand why Weil would have a say in the resource consent for further. What was the argument made, I guess, for Weil having a say over subdivisions in the eastern suburbs?
So Weil submitted in the hearing that they had an interest as because of reverse sensitivity, so they would be concerned that if there were applications for more houses within that noise area, that then they would be obliged to pay for things like insulation, which they've got some obligation to do in the inner noise area. The outer noise area, there's a greater risk of people making complaints and perhaps asking the council for constraints on the airport's operations. So they are clearly an affected party, so that was their request through the hearings.
Within this, has there been any change to the noise overlay, like the geographical area when we're looking over a map? That hasn't increased or decreased, has it? It's still the same as it is now?
I can confirm that with you in writing, I think, just to make sure. But to my recollection, the lines are generally the same, but though the nomenclature and the naming and the description, to my view, is a little bit more consistent and easier to follow. Well, the panel actually may have views on that as well. That's what their recommendation is, but I can confirm that to you as well.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Just clarifying that in the subdivision design guide recommendation to be deleted, did we lose any of the requirements around permeable surfaces?
I may defer that to my colleague. Yeah. So this is Hannah Van Halen Giles, and she was the subdivision expert from the council.
Hi, good afternoon. Could you please repeat your question?
With the recommendation to delete the subdivision guide, have we lost any of the rules or recommendations around permeable surfaces?
No, we haven't. They are in standards within the subdivision chapter itself.
Great.
Councillor McNulty.
Just was curious, in that subdivision chapter there was reference to needing a suitably qualified heritage professional. Is that defined, or is that a officer looks at the CV and takes into a scope whether they're, is that specific around what that is?
It's a term used in the heritage chapter, which is where it comes from. I'm checking now if it is defined. It doesn't appear to be.
And then, this might be in the weeds, but the changes around Upper Stebbings and Glenside West, I was just interested in how those reflected some of the submitters. I think Barry Ellis was maybe one of them, and the Glenside Progressive Association, but that might be one for a written response.
Those were the submitters that sought greater protection for the ridgetop and Upper Stebbings.
Yeah, I'm interested in what they asked for and then where the commissioners have landed in terms of the gap. But maybe that can come back offline. Yeah.
Councillor Free.
So if I understood your response to Councillor O'Neill, it was that the air noise overlay lines hadn't changed from the beginning of this process to the end of it?
Again, that is my recollection, but I will have to confirm that in
And
writing.
could we please, and this could be a question offline, could we please have that map? At least the Eastern councillors might be more interested than others, but...
Yes, so those maps are actually on your viewer as well, so you can check those. May I also just say through the chair that we are collecting these written responses that you've been asking us for through these briefings, and we're expecting to have them to you hopefully by the end of the week. Just so we haven't forgotten them, and we'll begin them to you shortly.
And can I just ask about the road, the back of the airport, currently known as Stuart Duff Drive? We have an MOU with the airport, I think, that if that ever disappeared, that we'd have some ability to have a similar connection, but somewhere else. Is that reflected at all in the district plan, or is it just an informal thing? The other day it was out of action and there was chaos in the city.
The only place in the district plan it would appear would be if there was a designation for it, or if there was an airport structure plan. So we can have a look, but if it's not in those two things, it's not a district plan matter.
Okay, maybe Liam, you might be able to answer. I'll send through a question about that.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. I actually don't think it is, Sean, but Councillor Free's referring to an agreement by letter from Weil and Council about the permanency of that linked road through as a resilience issue and also just connectivity for the community. So, but we will provide more certain advice to you, Councillor.
Councillor Chung.
Great, thank you. The first question is on Ridgeline and Hilltops. Now, my understanding is that there is a policy now that prohibits building on ridgelines and hilltops. So what does this new discretionary rule allow? Does that allow discretion on allowing people to build on there or not?
So the new discretionary rule is just in relation to the ridgetop area, which was a gap that was left out of the notified plan. But yes, the rule would stop people. It would make it a discretionary activity to undertake earthworks in the ridge top area.
Oh, so I understand. So because we have that rule in place, does that mean that having a discretionary rule, they can apply to actually build on those? Is that right?
So they can apply to do earthworks. So it may not be building, they may be cutting a track or a road.
I see. Yep. Okay, great, thank you. Second question, regarding the inner air noise overlay, there's a new policy that was mentioned on there. So what does this new policy entail? That would increase the area? Would that change that air noise overlay?
I'll get back to you on that question, if that's all right.
Great, thanks. And the last question is, building inside the air noise perimeter now, overlay now, there's mitigation in the building plans to actually allow a building to go on there if they have suitable insulation and things. So again, would there be any council sort of responsibility if they consider this noise to be excessive, if they measure the noise, and then can they come back to council to say that, look, it's much noisier?
So the district plan works in setting the standards that need to be met for the insulation and ventilation, and so if those are met, then in principle, or in theory, and ideally in practice as well, the noise from the airport would go down to an appropriate level within the house. So I guess anyone could always complain, but then the council would say, well, actually, has this insulation been put in? Yes. Well, then it's actually at a tolerable level, acceptable level.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just in terms of noise standards, with more density, there'll be more noise, people living close to each other. So the changes that the commissioners have recommended, will that make it a bit better for people overall?
Do we want to forward that to panel, or? It's just, Councillor, your question about making things better for people is
and quite
value
so
judgment.
Well, yeah, I know, but generally people would like to be able to sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning unless they live on Courtney Place.
So in terms of quieter, so this was an area of considerable debate between experts about what different measurements and different techniques of lowering noise would do for people's health and well-being within the housing. And so the panel had to consider the different experts' opinions and come to a conclusion about what they thought was optimal. So the panel may want to comment on which ones they prefer, but it was quite a technical exercise.
Okay, that's helpful. And just my other question around earthworks and subdivision rules, will this do more or less to protect the natural environment that any development occurs?
So as my colleague Hannah was saying, these rules that are being recommended by the panel are to plug gaps or to make sure that there are provisions to protect significant natural areas and ridge lines that weren't previously in the notified plan, so that it is adding additional protection.
Yes, sorry, I did see the ridge lines in the SNAs, which is great, but I'm just thinking just the general environment.
Hannah, any comments beyond that?
Okay, so it's just those things which have been designated as being significant, in other words.
I think, Councillor, you may have to, again, go back probably to the panel's report and their views on the acceptability of the earthwork standards.
Okay, that brings us to the end of that.
Yes.
Yes.
I would now ask the commissioners to come forward,
Fabulous.
and if councillors have any questions for them.
Any questions for our panel? Councillor Pannett.
Thank you for coming back to help us out. So look, the thing which I have the biggest questions around is the city centre excluded from the hydraulic neutrality rules, and just whether you could just talk a bit. I have a particular concern around that, given the climate change and the impact on every part of our city, but particularly the central city, which of course is very built up.
Just as a starting basis, thank you, Councillor, we had to sort of kind of weigh up the evidence there was to assess the impact of applying that in both the CCZ and elsewhere with the sort of intensification drive through the MPS. With the CCZ, we did have evidence from a developer who brought along a structural engineer to indicate that an apartment building that was being proposed will be built very shortly, would add at least $1 million to the cost of it, not just the retention tank, but all the structural engineering to go around it to support that process. So we were a little bit concerned about the economic impact that might have, and as a dampener on further development or driving up the costs of housing. And the same point was really in contention for just infill development as well. We considered there wasn't really sufficient evidence to show what the impact that would have, the economic impact it had on development, housing development per se, and whether it would, no pun intended, dampen the drive for intensification there. Hydraulic neutrality itself is a well understood and well practiced concept around the country. And it is generally understood to be you don't worsen the situation than what is at the moment. And that's what the submitters were telling us, as nobody questioned that principle or concept. It was just expanding that to then got to keep the stormwater to that level.
So can I just ask then, did you consider the economic impacts of climate change on the city? Because there is a cost at some point. Yeah.
We had evidence from the council about the general overall costs of stormwater and how the problems about fixing it, just generally citywide at a high level.
Okay, but with more rain, there will be more flooding, and so there will be a cost at some point. So it's just about how you balance those.
That's correct. It's getting that balance right. So the modelling would take into account climate change to apply hydraulic neutrality, particularly to the more complicated and larger developments, housing developments.
Okay, and just my last question for now. I put an amendment through, as you heard from my question, that we would actually go further than just not making it worse, which I find very difficult to listen to. And I wanted to go further to make sure that we got a positive environment and a lot more green infrastructure, which is actually good for people's health and wellbeing too. So did you look at whether we could go further than hydraulic neutrality? Thank you.
Yes, because part of the suite of Three Waters policies and rules are around water-sensitive design, and where they encourage water-sensitive design to improve not only the quantity being removed from sites, but also the quality, because they work in conjunction. And there are policies to promote that, but it just recognises the practicalities of it may not always be possible for every site. There just may be site constraints that would prevent it from being maximised, but there are those rules in the plan for that to occur.
Councillor Brown.
In general, how much weight did you put on sort of infrastructure deficits when it came to densification? I mean, when you looked at areas of the city, I mean, I can see you've got all of these various criteria around heritage, character, trees, skyline, hydraulic neutrality, but what about the other factors such as transport and Three Water infrastructure? How important was that in your thinking, or is that something which becomes it's the city's problem to actually fill in the gaps if people end up going in certain areas where there isn't the facilities now?
Yes. Well, with Three Waters as an example, as you heard earlier today, the requirements will be for the developer to ensure there's adequate, they meet all the regional standards around water, Three Waters. So where there is a deficit in the city, we didn't have detailed information about exactly everywhere in the city. That will have to be addressed either by the developer in some way or other, or it would have to be part of a general council infrastructure improvement program.
That one. So you know how the matrix we saw showed that there was no deficit of fresh water in Kelburn, so there was no need. Now, if you had known, for instance, that Kelburn had a situation where a significant increase in densification would result in there being a significant shortfall and therefore a large expense on somebody's cost, whether it's a developer or the city, would that have informed your decision about the allowable level of densification, or is that sort of like somebody else's problem?
Can I give you an example stemming from the residential chapter? The council gave us specific evidence opposing Kaingora's submission seeking greater heights, greater urban capacity in Karori, specifically on the basis of the wastewater deficit. And that was the evidence we relied on in rejecting Kaingora's submission. So certainly in that instance, we had specific evidence on infrastructure capacity that we took into account. So so I think it was more generally, as Robert says, we were told it was being controlled through the Three Waters chapter, the kind of provisions that Robert is now talking about, but that was one specific example we took into account. Well, we took it into account where we had evidence, but...
Councillor Chung.
Great, thanks. My question is about hydraulic neutrality. If you're developing a property, if someone comes out and develops a property, then the neutrality won't be able to be achieved because, of course, they're putting non-permeable materials in there. So is there a penalty or a charge for that organisation when they're doing that? So if they can't achieve that, and is there a facility to say that, well, because you've now got these areas, we will charge you a certain amount?
Well, in short, they may not get consent to build if that is the case. It's very common now to see, say, multi-unit developments to have retention tanks, as been talked about as part of that development, as well as swales and water-sensitive design. It's very common, not just in Wellington City, but all around. So it is part now generally of the development costs around the city. And so that it's kind of not new to them in terms of greenfield developments or intensification projects.
Okay, so did you consider mitigating this if, rather than sort of deny a resource consent or building consent, to mitigate the non-permeable surfaces? I did a project in Europe some years ago where the EU brought in this new law which stated that if you have non-permeable surfaces on your property, you will get charged a certain amount, and they based it on a per square metre basis. So what people started doing then was they replaced all their driveways and all their non-permeable areas with concrete blocks where the rain actually came through the blocks. And so I view that as quite a good thing. So would that be feasible in New Zealand?
You're slightly stretching my technical knowledge around that sphere, but it sounds quite feasible to me based on my experience elsewhere.
Great, that's excellent, thank you.
Councillor Pennant.
Two questions. The noise. So we've heard from the officers that you did give that quite a lot of consideration. I guess just will it basically allow people, the rules that you put in place, quiet enjoyment of their home at appropriate times of the day? Bearing in mind not everyone works 9 to 5, obviously, but...
as was explained, we had two competing sets of expert advice around that to retain the old way of measuring noise internally and the newer way. Now, the newer way, which was recommended by council officers to apply consistently across the city, including the air noise, the airport noise area, we were advised would produce a slightly better internal environment than the other way of measuring noise, because that had to be weighed up against the increased costs of what the materials and things used for that. But it was based on the Courtenay Place entertainment precinct, is it? The effectiveness of that noise insulation standard, and how that, we were advised, had dropped noise complaints over the years since it was in place.
Okay, that's helpful. And just the last question around, I heard the answer around the SNAs and the ridge tops, but whether the rules that you've considered will give general protection to the natural environment in any subdivision or noise earthworks?
In general, there wasn't opposition to the standards for earthworks as such. There was some debate around the definitions of cut and fill and things, but the only real areas of debate were earthworks in the ridge tops, which, as you heard, was an omission, a gap in the things which we were recommending being filled. No pun here either.
You've just reminded me about noise, and would there be any facility in the new policy or new rules for looking at the amount of noise emitting from building sites? Now, I've noticed that in Japan, what they do is that they give it a building permit and they put a condition about the amount of noise that actually come out of that site. And so, but of course, that's very hard to measure. So what they do is the requirement is actually to build noise level meters inside that site, and then on the fence, on the perimeter fence, they actually have a display. And so they show you what the decibel rating is at that particular time. And so then they say that those noise levels can only apply during, say, 9 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, and then they give a lower level sort of later on that, and that comes into what Councillor Pannett was saying, that they don't want these noise levels coming out of the site very early in the morning or late at night. So is there a consideration to introduce these rules on building sites?
I'm not aware there are in the proposed notified plan, but there are. The district plan does apply the New Zealand standards for construction noise and vibration around the country. It does apply those to construction activities.
To the end. Oh, not bad. Well, I really want to thank you both for your time again. And yeah, that's it. Sorry, I've lost for words. Blah, blah, blah. All right.
Kia ora.
Done.